Welcome, JBS viewers, to the ISGAP Hour. That's ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I'm David Harris. I'm the Vice Chair of ISGAP. I'm joined here in the New York studio by Dr. Charles Small, the founding director and scholar warrior of ISGAP. And today we have two special guests. In the first segment, we are joined by Dr. Yossi Shain, a distinguished academic. If I read you his whole bio, it would take the full 30 minutes. But he is a professor emeritus of political science at Tel Aviv University. He has been a full professor at Georgetown University. He himself did his PhD at Yale University. In addition to that academic life, he is the author of many books. He has served in the Knesset, and he's been an advisor to many, many government commissions. He's an intellectual, a public intellectual, and he's what I would call a big idea thinker. Yossi, welcome to the ISGAP Hour.
It's a pleasure being with you and Charles, David.
Yossi, I don't know where to begin and how to parcel out this limited time we have, because you are a big thinker and you see the larger strategic picture. But begin to paint for us what you see after October 7th in terms of longer-term implications for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the U.S.-Israel relationship, the kinds of issues you've been dealing with for so much of your academic life.
I don't think we can overstate the trauma that we are now experiencing, which in my opinion will shape our future in so many ways. This is a trauma that will redefine us, that basically defines the essence of what does it mean to be a Jewish nation, will redefine our question of morality, question of peoplehood, will redefine the very existence of the state of Israel amongst nation and, of course, vis-a-vis the diaspora, and will also bring us challenges ahead if we are into a tikkun, into reshaping our life, because this is a moment, we're experiencing a moment not only of a tragedy that struck us, of an immense, I would say, kind of like emotional nature, and of course painful emotional nature that brings back memories of the Holocaust, that brings back destruction, that brings back the fears of existence, but also calls for action if we wish to become a normal nation once again, and the Jewish people reorganizing themselves in a better shape. I think this is a mega moment in Jewish history.
So Yossi,
and I don't exaggerate.
Yossi, to borrow from an oft-used phrase, in every crisis, don't lose sight of the opportunity. Do you see, looking beyond the current crisis, the trauma, the tragedy, the fact that hostages are still being held after 4.5 months, what are the opportunities you see here, both for the State of Israel and for Israel-diaspora relations?
Look, we are in the midst of a war. We are talking while the Israeli army is still fighting in Gaza. The Galilee has been evacuated completely, and one should see it in order to understand what it means. The southern part, the western southern part, evacuated. We are waiting to see whether there will be war in Lebanon with all the repercussions. So right now, what I see is immense patriotism, a sense of urgency, mobilization, not of all parts of the nation, because we are seeing parts of the nation which are not part of this war, which is very alarming also. Significant parts are not part of this war. And we are seeing a very huge gap between the bravery and the heroism of the Israeli people and the poverty of Israeli representative and its government. We see a huge gap between the desire to bring back Israeli life into a positive mode versus the inability of the political system to really seize the moment. And these are huge challenges that we will face into the future. So we can draw tremendous optimism from the mobilization of Israeli civil society, from the patriotism and heroism of Israeli soldiers, from the unity that we see being presented in the IDF, to the other challenges that are awaiting us, which I described, notwithstanding, of course, what brought the fiasco into this moment, things that will have to be worked out in the near future and beyond, including the role of the IDF, where the IDF is standing, which is the symbol of Israel, which is the essence of Israel's existence. How do we reshape it? The reshaping of Israel and the Jewish world, I think, is what's at stake.
So let me just pick up on that last point before turning to you, Charles. Talk to us a little bit about the Jewish world dimension of the conversation. What do you see as the potential impact longer term, structurally? Do you see Israel and the diaspora coming closer together? Do you see new institutions being formed? Or over time, do you see further drifting apart?
I think what we see is two conflicting, I would say, trajectories. One is we see that the diaspora understands fully that its life are intertwined with the Israeli life. When Israel is in peril, when the Jewish state is attacked so viciously, and when Israelis are kidnapped and raped and burned to death, the diaspora immediately suffers from anti-Semitism. And we see, because the security of the diaspora was always entangled with the power of Israel. When Israel not only is powerful, but projecting power, the diaspora feel more secure. When Israel has been projecting weakness and has been discovered as perhaps vulnerable as never before, the diaspora has become vulnerable. So this is showing the so-called kind of like connection, the interconnection between the diaspora and Israel. And the empathy is great, and the attacks on the Jews and anti-Semitism embellish this relation. And yet, the fact that Israel is suffering, as it is right now, and is being challenged on so many fronts, has brought also voices in the diaspora to rethink the very essence of Zionism. Is Zionism is the ultimate solution of modernity to the security of the Jews? Or perhaps, as some have articulated in America, Zionism has shown itself incapable to provide security, and maybe the Jews need other security. This has led to some people articulating a new diasporism view. Others are kind of like thinking, should we distance or not? Depends where they stand politically and otherwise. It's certainly reshaping diaspora-Israeli relation, and the institutions that are related to this are having to take note, because they're still waiting to see where we are moving. And final point for this question, because it's all also related to where the diaspora, what diaspora we are talking about. We see how the British diaspora is in peril. We see the question that the French diaspora is asking. But the large diaspora, the American Jewish diaspora, we see how they see that American connection to Israel is essential, how America protection of Israel is so critical. And the question is, where do they stand with regard to America's behavior and America's future relation with Israel in light of the challenges that are emerging between the Israeli government and the U.S. government?
Charles, lots of profound questions there.
Yeah, definitely. So, Yossi, thanks for being here. Yossi, you wrote a very important book on the Israel century and how Israel was sort of becoming the center of Jewish life, superseding the diaspora, superseding the American Jewish community. That Israel was a center of political power, culture, intellectual power, and with significant assimilation of the American Jewish community in the United States. There was assimilation, and that the United States was also, in a way, withdrawing from the world and showing signs of decline and weakness, and that Israel was the new center of Jewish life. So we had October the 7th in Israel, and I think we had October the 9th in the United States and in the diaspora. When we went back to work, when we went back to our universities, and we saw our students and our colleagues, our faculty, we were shocked with an avalanche of anti-Semitism. Last night, I was with a group of entrepreneurs, young Jewish leaders in their 30s, amazingly successful, bright, committed young Jewish Americans, also some French and British Jews who relocated to the United States because of anti-Semitism. And my question to you is, after October the 7th, after October the 9th, do the American Jewish community or the American Jewish, young American Jews, do they have the luxury now to drift away and assimilate and distance themselves from Israel? Or, as you said, because of the situation in the Middle East, our fates are completely intertwined? And perhaps American Jews can't escape the connection we have to Israel, even if they want to. Has your view on Israel-diaspora relations shifted after the horrible events of October the 7th and October the 9th?
Look, it's a little bit risky, one would say, to take this event and put everything around it. But I think a mega event has happened, and it did. The October event is also compounded by the painful rupture that existed in Israel throughout the year, throughout 2023. Some people would say that Israel was drifting into a civil war mode, as you remember, with all the shaping of the legal system and the democracy and so on. So I am not giving any advice to diaspora Jewry, but it's clear in my mind, and that's what I've written about, that if you wish to stay within the Jewish people, within the Jewish fold in the communities, unless you are an ultra-Orthodox, Israel is playing a critical factor in your life. And Israeli attachment is part and parcel, and Israel's symbols and Israel's culture and everything that relates to Israel is important to your Jewish identity. You may try to move away from it, but basically it's there to be because of the centrality of Israel to Jewish life, because of numbers, because of the evolution of Jewish nationalism in the 20th and 21st century. And yet, of course, many people are thinking, what does it mean? One thing I want to share with you, which I'm always touched by, many of the fallen soldiers and the fighting soldiers we see are lone soldiers, what they call. People are coming from America, young American men and women who have volunteered to, and many of them have been killed in the Israeli army. Many are looking to help Israel, and many are shocked, as you say, to see how the attacks on Jews have been framed as an attack on Israel's behavior, much more than they have known before, perhaps, or they've forgotten, because every generation has been facing it. And no one like you and David, of course, remember what happened after September 11 and prior to that, and was equated Zionism and racism in 1975. So this is not the first time. But I think every generation is growing into a new experience. And the experience that now the younger generation in America is seeing, which is also related to the shifts in American society and American culture and American campuses, and the struggle between the progressives and the right wing and so on, are seeing how the Israeli component is critical for their definition. How they will react, what they will do. I've been attached, in the last year I was asked by the president of Brandeis University, one of the leading Jewish universities in America, to be kind of a liaison of Brandeis in Israel. And I saw President Leibovich is kind of like talking about it in his own campus, which has become more sectarian, kind of like, because the majority of the students are not Jewish. And while other campuses, we know what happened. We remember what happened with the presidents of leading American university and the result of that. So we are in the middle of an event that people are trying to see what will happen and how to define themselves. One point that is very resonating also with what David has been dealing with for many years is the attempt to undermine Israel's legitimacy, not only as the Jewish state, but to undermine the experience of the Jews in the Holocaust. It's not by mistake that people are trying to claim that Israel is conducting a genocide in order to undermine the very argument of the Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust as if they are the victims. The very notion of Jewish victimhood has been taken away by the argument that Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians. There's abysmal charge that is brought also in Hague. And this is something which is so pronounced now on campuses, on the alternative media, and so on, and very disturbing. And we have really to coalesce and understand that this type of attacks on Jews and Jewish memory and Jewish experiences is really engulfing all of us. And we have to respond much more effectively than we do.
Yossi, you put a lot on the table there. Let me just try and add to what's on the table. At least until October 7th, the belief of many, if not most, was can we or can we not get to a two-state solution? The argument goes back to the Peel Commission in 1937 to 1947, all the way up, as you know, through the 21st century. But it seems since October 7th, the cat's out of the bag. And the discussion is not about the two-state solution, rather it's about the one-state solution. In other words, whether Israel even has a right to exist. The whole public debate now seems to be about from the river to the sea. In the midst of this, European and American leaders come along and say, let's return to a two-state solution. Is this the right time? And does this become more or less viable in light of recent events?
I think that the two-state solution is now more of a slogan, kind of like an attempt to put something on the table with the understanding that it cannot be executed. There is no monopoly over the means of violence, not in Gaza, of course, we saw what happened, and not by the Palestinian Authority. So, but I said we have to give something, a two-state solution, a peaceful arrangement. Out of chaos and mayhem, out of terror and horror, we will come to live side by side. Because the other alternative, as you say, is one larger state, either a Palestinian state or in our midst. There are those who are also advancing one larger state, which are the extreme right-wingers, who are so dominating in our government. So we have a big problem here. The two-state solution, I think, is only there because there is nothing else to put on the table. No one knows what really to put on the table to entice a certain discussion. They don't think about the re-establishment of Palestinian entity with the democratic liberal values. They cannot see it. They don't know where the boundaries are. They don't see how to draw the new maps. So they have to put it on the table as a way of telling the other Arab states, let's have a vision into the future which will allow us to make progress and put an end to this war. I do not object to the rhetoric, but I have to make a point. The execution of such a vision requires so much before really we can start to move even a little bit into the future. And that is why it's so, it's in many ways, it's a detour that comes to haunt us, because everybody is hanging on this expression saying, we cannot do it, we are against it, and then they do not deal with the real issues that are at stake.
So Yossi, maybe looking in the more positive direction, even though these times are very difficult, do you see the potential for peace with the Saudis? And if the Israelis and the Saudis, who I think at some level have common concerns with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian revolutionary regime's quest for a nuclear weapon, are you optimistic that the Israeli-Saudi peace could still be forged? And if so, could this be a way with the Saudis on board to maybe create a more moderate Palestinian leadership that would recognize a two-state solution? I know maybe I'm thinking too far down the road, but what are your thoughts?
I think that in order to advance in the Middle East into and bringing Saudis to the table and eventually a peace deal, Israel has to express its new power in the region, which was taken away on October 7th. Right. What does it mean? It doesn't have to behave like a bully in the region, but it has to reestablish deterrence. It has to reestablish its power in a sensible fashion, first in Gaza, secondly via Hezbollah, and of course to reestablish its alliances and its partners in the fight against Iran, the nemesis that is bringing such chaos into the region. Once people will know in the region, and the Saudis in particular, that Israel is not so vulnerable anymore and has rebuilt its strength and is now coming back to become a stable nation that can bring kind of like broader peace into the region, there will be tremendous incentive for the Saudis to come to the table and sign a peace deal. Keep in mind, the Saudis were ready to do so. Now they're again hanging on the issue of this two-state solution as if they know what it means even into the future. I don't think they care about this concept. What they care about that Israel really can deliver the goods in terms of stability, economics, and becoming a partner in what the Abraham Accord began to do several years back, or perhaps even the peace with Egypt many years back. Before we manage to do so, before we manage really to defeat our enemies, to show that this will not be repeated, that we have regained our power, reorganized our internal sense of strength, and regained the Israeli I would say, mentalite that we lost on October 7th, I think that such an arrangement will be premature for the Saudis. They are watching us more than anything else.
And while the Saudis are watching Israel, Israel is centrally watching Iran. And my question to you, Yossi, is there still a major gap between the Israeli perspective and perhaps the perspective of others in the region towards Iran and the Western behavior towards Iran? As someone said to me as recently as the other day, the American policy seems to be to respond to Iran's proxies rather than to Iran itself, whereas Israel and its closest partners in the region are saying the only way to deal with the snake is to cut off the head. Is there still that gap? And how do you see the Iran issue being dealt with in light of what's happened?
It has been for a long time the desire of Iran to have its proxies weakening the state of Israel. October 7th and what is happening on the border with Hezbollah has been weakening Israel. But now we are hoping that there will be a shift, that if indeed Iran starting to understand that Hamas will not go back to power in any fashion, that Hezbollah is in danger of being destroyed by Israel because it's testing Israel's limits and has caused Israel pain, but Israel will not have another choice but to fight Hezbollah. It is a sign for the Iranians that they may lose their basis in the region in order to exercise their own power. You know, as the octopus, as former Prime Minister Bennett did describe it, as the octopus with its legs. So the Iranian issue is not only the nuclear threat, but its desire over the years to use its power, an expansionist mode of power of Islamism, via its proxies in the region. At this stage, it is Israel's goal to undercut these proxies. The war in Gaza will basically destroy Hamas, and that's a clear case. Otherwise, nothing will happen here, and it will reverberate that we have not been successful. And we will have a huge job of destroying Hezbollah, which I cannot tell you how it will be. It's too early to tell, because we're still kind of fighting a war which is testing the water, whether it will be a complete kind of explosion. But the Iranians are watching, and so those who are against Iran and are fearful of Iran are watching. to see whether they are getting ahead or whether they will be defeated on that front. And the front of the nuclear weapon, of course, which is the more dangerous one, we have lost some time. One has to admit, we have lost some time because we're dealing with the secondary issue. And without the United States, we will not be able to solve this issue of Iran as a nuclear threat to the region. And this will become a huge issue for the entire world, including the Europeans and of course, the Americans, let alone, of course, what is happening with the Russians. We cannot deal with all the issues. But these are major questions that you're asking me, and I'm trying just to touch a little bit on them.
And Yossi, unfortunately, we have just another minute left in this segment, but you 10 years ago already began to speak about Qatar and its very sophisticated, devious diplomacy. ISGAP, as you know, has been focusing very much on Qatar today. In just a few seconds, Qatar, friend or foe?
Look, I wrote my essay in the American Interest, the journal, in 2014, indicating to the world how Qatar is playing a double game. The two faces of Qatar, I called it. And, on the one hand is catering to the West, on the other hand, fomenting chaos and Islamism. Qatar is now has the spotlight on Qatar. They have to deliver something because otherwise they will be seen only as supporters of Hamas. If Hamas is being destroyed and Qatar understanding that they have to readopt to this reality, we will be benefiting. But one has to admit, we, as much as I have identified the two faces of Qatar, Israel also played with the two faces of Qatar. We have used the Qataris to deliver money to the Hamas because we thought we can somewhat contain Hamas. Qataris have been used by everybody in that. So we have to really adopt our own policies. We understand that Qatar also has relation with the United States. It is incumbent on us to define and to tell the Qataris what are the boundaries of their behavior, how much we can tolerate, and not also to have two faces. Once we have two faces, we are being hijacked quickly.
Charles, I'd say that Yossi gave us a lot of food for thought.
Definitely.
As always, and as promised. And now, Yossi, we say thank you to you. And in the second half of this show, we turn to another continent and an equally pressing issue. And that is the question of South Africa and its role in pursuing this absurd, outrageous genocide charge against the state of Israel. Yossi, on behalf of ISGAP and the ISGAP Hour, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Yossi.
Thank you for giving me the time, and I look forward to seeing you both soon.
Me too, in Oxford, for Israel. And today we're very honored to have Karen Milner. Karen is the chairperson of the South African Board of Jewish Deputies, and she's also the vice president of the World Jewish Congress. Karen is a professor of psychology in the School of Human and Community Development at Wits University in South Africa. And I had the privilege of meeting Karen originally years ago when she was a scholar in residence at the ISGAP Oxford Summer Program. So Karen, thank you very much for joining us. And as you know, I think many in the Jewish community in the United States and around the world are watching with concern about the situation in South Africa, specifically of the Jewish community there in South Africa. Recently, we know that the South African government, which has been antagonistic to Israel and even the Jewish community for years, seemed to have taken it up to another level by supporting Hamas, openly sharing their connections to the Iranian revolutionary regime and even Qatar, and bringing a case of alleged genocide to The Hague, accusing Israel of genocide. How is this being played out, I guess, on the ground for the Jewish community?
Thanks very much, Charles, and really thank you for inviting me to be on this program. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I do appreciate the concern that has been expressed around the world, in particular our friends in the United States, for the difficult position that South African Jewry finds itself. So in terms of how it's played out, I think we really need to go right back to October the 7th, the real schism that kind of at some level really not just shook all of our worlds, but divided the world into pre-October the 7th and post-October the 7th for Israel, for global Jewry, and for South African Jewry. But unlike perhaps Jewry around the world in most democratic countries, when other democratic countries' governments lit up their public spaces with the Israeli flag, stood in solidarity with Israel against this appalling invasion of their territory, almost immediately, basically, effectively on the 7th or the 8th of October, the South African government effectively, in their statements, effectively stood with Hamas. And that really set the tone for the engagement between the South African government and firstly the South African Jewish community, and then the engagement with the South African with Israel, moving on from that time, culminating for us as a South African Jewish community on the 29th of December, when the South African government launched its case at the ICJ against Israel. And I think it's really had a very distressing impact on the South African Jewish community, largely because although the ANC government, which is the government in power at the moment, has always had a deep sympathy with Palestinians, it goes right back to the roots of the ANC when it was in exile in South Africa fighting against apartheid, and some of the relationships it had in the Soviet Union with the PLO. It's never taken that relationship, but it's always recognized the sensitivities and the views of an important constituency in South Africa, which is the Jewish community. And across the various actions that the government have taken since the 7th of October, at some level, it's really ripped the fabric of South African society apart as well, in the way it has taken this conflict and dealt with it completely differently from every other conflict that it's dealt with. And I think that the hypocrisy is quite self-evident if you look at the way in which the South African government have dealt, for example, with the Russia-Ukraine war, and their espoused position on most foreign conflicts, which is a position of non-alignment and engaging with both sides. It's only when it comes to the Jewish state that the ANC government have taken a position very, very much on one side. They have not only taken a position against Israel right at the outset from the 7th of October, but our Minister of Foreign Affairs made a phone call to Hamas, which we found out about from the Hamas website soon after the 7th of October, and then the ANC also welcomed Hamas to our country in December. So there's a lot to go through, but that gives you some idea of how difficult it has been for the South African Jewish community.
Karen, why do you think, to me as an outsider, you know I was active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was actually the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee in Canada and the United Kingdom in the 1980s and 90s. And I was always impressed with the South African Freedom Charter, that the ANC was committed to developing a social democracy in which all people, regardless of race, nation, religion, gender, economic background, would be equal under one legal system in a social democracy. How is it possible that the ANC is supporting Hamas, which is a regime that literally has its roots in Nazism, an ideology connected deeply to the apartheid regime and Verwoerd and Smuts and the founders of the apartheid system that had deep connections to Nazism and fascism? How is it possible that the ANC would support such a reactionary, genocidal, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic movement? Is it anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Is it possible that the ANC is being supported and paid by the Iranian revolutionary regime and even Qatar? Why is this being played out with such, contradictions and no diplomacy? They've put their weight behind Hamas. Why do you think that's happened?
So I think it's probably multifactorial, and I don't have a clear and easy answer for you on that. When I say it's multifactorial, I think we need to understand a little bit of the South African government's response in terms of the geopolitical stance it's been taking in recent years. So in recent years, the government of South Africa have looked away from kind of Western democratic allies and more towards more anti-democratic countries in anti-democratic areas such as Russia, China, and as we know, Iran. One of the things that I did neglect to mention earlier when I spoke to you earlier is, in addition to the call with Hamas, there was a fairly unheralded meeting between our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who flew to Iran in this period on a fairly quiet visit where she met with the Iranian government. So for the last few years, we've definitely seen that despite the fact that our major trading partners sit in the West, sit in Europe, Western Europe and America, the government has been increasingly looking to Russia, China, Iran in particular, as its natural allies. The reasons for that are really, I think, more about geopolitical concerns than the specific concerns that we have around Israel. But we have to recognize that the circles in which they are engaging and the circles that they're looking to find friendships are deeply, deeply anti-Israel and arguably anti-Semitic circles that they are mixing in at the moment. And I think that's it's quite a kind of a problematic contradiction for the South African Jewish community, because this is not only problematic for Jews in South Africa, it's deeply problematic for all South Africans in terms of the way in which it's starting to turn its back on Western democracies and moving more and more towards these anti-democratic countries. I think your question about financing is there's no proof, there's no evidence in terms of the financing argument, but there have been a lot of allegations that it seemed odd that the ANC for the last few months have been in such dire financial straits that they were basically being sequestrated. And all of a sudden, they seem to have found significant amounts of money to fund their current election campaign. I also think it's a really useful distraction from the tremendous troubles that the ANC find itself in, given the lack of service delivery, problem electricity services, lack of water, etc. It's found a space for itself to present itself as this kind of proud activist on the global stage, which has been very useful to distract from its shortcomings in South Africa.
Charles, can I jump in here, if I may? Karen, a few questions, if I could. Can you dial back for a moment for JBS viewers who may not know facts and figures? How large is the Jewish community in South Africa today? What's been the trend line going back, say, to the end of the apartheid era and the onset of the Nelson Mandela leadership? So talk to us, first of all, about the Jewish community today.
Sure. So the Jewish community has very deep roots in South Africa. The organization that I'm the chair of is actually an older organization, even in the ANC. We're over 100 years old. And at its heart, the Jewish community, which largely comes from Lithuania, most of us have our roots in Eastern Europe and Lithuania, fleeing various pogroms between the wars and just before First World War as well. And at its heart, the South African Jewish community was around 120,000. Over the years, since the 1950s and 1960s, various concerns about South Africa, both during apartheid and post-apartheid, has seen a shrinking community. And the estimate at the moment is around 57,000 Jews in South Africa. So it really is a tiny minority, primarily in the two urban centres, which is Johannesburg and Cape Town. It is a very vibrant community, though, and a very strong community that punches well above its weight economically, culturally, and in terms of Jewish life as well.
So since October the 7th in particular, Karen, in your role as the chairperson, what kind of access do you have to decision makers in government, if any? Or are they keeping you far away?
So I'm going to go back to Charles's comment, which he reminded me of the South African Freedom Charter. It's also the preamble to our constitution, which states that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And we take our constitution very, very seriously. And I am a South African, and we truly believe that we will assert our rights, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Over the period since the 7th of October, the official representatives of the South African Jewish community met initially with the ANC, with the senior leadership of the ANC, to express our deep disappointment, dismay, and really betrayal over the way in which the ANC had responded to the 7th of October attacks. as we spoke to them, we expressed really our hurt at the fact that there had never been a word of condolence or compassion about the people who were killed on the 7th of October, about the kidnapped, including South African citizens who had never heard any message at all from their own government. So we expressed that real hurt, that as a South African Jewish community who were contributing as much, if not more than others, to the real building, nation building in South Africa, this lack of compassion, no calling for the release of hostages, the hypocritical stance that I've mentioned before. And we felt at that point, although it was there were elements of the meeting that were quite hostile, we did feel that that impression and those feelings had been heard by the ANC. We were then called at very short notice into a meeting with the president at the presidential residence in Pretoria in December. And this was just before the ICJ case. We had been calling for a meeting with the president for a while, and we had also taken this into the public domain. After 7th of October, we took out a full-page advert in the Sunday Times, which I suppose in some ways is equivalent to a full-page advert in the New York Times in South African sense, where we sent an open letter and we expressed our deep disappointment in our government. And we had this meeting with the president, where we raised issues of anti-Semitism. There's been boycotts of Jewish businesses and lack of consular services for South Africans in Israel. But unfortunately, just short weeks later, to our surprise, the ICJ case was launched.
So Karen, you met with the president, you expressed your hurt, your disappointment. What did the president say in response?
The president really, so we had it was we thought at the time that he had heard us, particularly on the 3 issues that he had raised, and he did afterwards release a press statement where he stated that anti-Semitism would not be tolerated in South Africa, that the boycott of Jewish businesses was not something that was supported in South Africa, and he gave 1 or 2 suggestions in terms of dealing with the diplomatic issues that we'd been experiencing. So at a very kind of superficial level, he certainly expressed the position that anti-Semitism, which is in South Africa, was seen, I think, in a different way to perhaps how we're seeing it now, but that anti-Semitism would not be tolerated in South Africa. Unfortunately, since then, our Minister of Justice, Minister Lamola, has denied that there is, in fact, any anti-Semitism in South Africa. And we have provided him with the statistics which show a 600% increase in anti-Semitic incidences since October in South Africa. And that's quite a worry, since the Minister of Justice is the person who will be in charge, effectively the head of the cases that we will be bringing very soon to courts in South Africa to prosecute some of these cases of anti-Semitism.
But I can't help but comment that the president condemned anti-Semitism in South Africa, but seemed to countenance anti-Semitism against Israel. Did he make any comments at all with respect to what happened in Israel? Did he show any sign of sympathy, empathy, compassion? Or did he avoid the subject or try and contradict you?
No. So at the end of the meeting, right at the end of the meeting, as it was drawing to a close, he reiterated the position that he stated was the position of the ANC, that they believed that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, and effectively that brought the meeting to an end. What was really very upsetting for the South African Jewish community, well, for us in particular, for the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, was this meeting was in fact cited in the court papers that were brought to the ICJ. And I think that while we've raised it in various press releases, etc., that in itself is really deeply anti-Semitic. And I think that anybody who understands the modicum of anti-Semitism recognizes that seeing a Jewish community as somehow representing the state of Israel is a deeply, deeply anti-Semitic act. We did find ourselves cited in the ICJ pleadings, and it is something that has certainly distressed our community enormously.
May I ask one or two more questions, Charles? So the obvious question, I'm sure, on the minds of a number of JBS viewers is Is there a future for Jews in South Africa? The number has already declined by some 50% from the peak that you mentioned 30, 40 years ago. What does tomorrow hold?
So it's really a good question, and I think I would have a couple of months ago, despite all the problems that South Africa was experiencing, and we do have problems outside of the anti-Semitism, as I said before, we have major electricity cuts through the day, water supply is not guaranteed. A couple of months ago, I would have said there's no question. The Jewish community has an enormous amount to offer South Africa, and we have an enormous amount to gain from South Africa. We do have, I believe, a community worth fighting for. And I feel very strongly that our constitution remains a firm protector of the Jewish community in South Africa. And we live, I don't know how, it's really difficult to explain to people outside of South Africa, but we live in a kind of paradoxical environment where our government is unbelievably hostile and is very hurtful in its hostility towards Israel for the Jewish community. At the same time, in spite of the increase in anti-Semitic incidences, but these are in line with, if not lower, in fact, than some of the anti-Semitic incidences that we've seen globally that have emerged post-October 7. We don't experience a sense of hostility on the ground in South Africa. So there's this kind of looming threat from the government. There's the hurt and the lack of recognition to some extent of the Jewish community as a viable, important community within the nation. And I talk about nation building because it's an important thing that we speak about post-apartheid, that we are trying to create this meshed nation out of these different communities. And that's been hurtful. But we don't see it that strongly on the ground. We don't experience the kind of things that are happening and that we've seen on the streets of London, New York, Sydney, Australia, etc., are in fact less in South Africa. We have a very rich Jewish life, and we continue to lead this rich Jewish life, and we feel very strongly protected by our constitution. This protection will be tested in the next few months as we take a number of these cases to court and as we see how and whether the Constitution will continue to protect us within this context. But while we believe that the Constitution protects us, while we believe the Constitution allows us to fight back, and we've done a number of fight backs, we haven't taken any of this lying down. The South African Jewish community has taken on its government in quite firm ways. While we believe that we can fight back, there are many in the community who don't want to leave and many in the community who can't leave. And it is a beautiful community. We're the last Jews of Africa. We're going to not allow ourselves to be pushed out of this continent.
Yeah, and Charles, have you been to South Africa?
I have, yeah, several times.
And I've also been several times. And what Karen is saying is absolutely on the money. This is truly one of the great Jewish communities in the world. It is one of the strongest, one of the proudest, one of the most Zionist, one of the most successful. And I feel very close to the community. I just have one more question, and I hand the mic back to Charles. You haven't mentioned, outside the Jewish community and outside the ANC, do you have allies, or do you feel largely alone in the Jewish community today?
We absolutely have allies. And what's probably important to mention also is that had we been taking on, for example, the government, the immediate post-apartheid government, so the government of Nelson Mandela, and even the person who came out after him, President Thabo Mbeki, firstly, I don't think we would have had to, because they had a moral compass that clearly the current South African government doesn't have. But we would have been in a very different situation. I think I would have been answering you quite differently, because they were seen as the heroes of the world. They had the support of approximately two-thirds, up to 70% of South Africans were supporting the ANC government at that point. At the moment, the current ANC government is barely scraping together 50% of the vote. We may not see a change in government now, but we are very, very likely to see a change in government at the next elections, and we're coming up to elections right now. So while it's a hard fight and nobody wants to be fighting the government, It's not a government that stands in particularly good stead, both in the world or within its own country. So from that point of view, that gives us a little bit of cold comfort, but a little bit of comfort nevertheless. There are Christian communities who definitely stand with the Jewish community and have done so very clearly. And most of the opposition parties, if we look at the positions of not all, but most of the opposition parties in South Africa, and South Africa is a very vigorous multi-party democracy. The other parties are gaining increasing percentages of the vote all the time, and they have not supported the position of the ANC government on Israel.
Good. Charles, back to you.
Yeah. So, Karen, I guess this question is, I'll ask the question at two levels. From a grassroots perspective, what is the greatest threat, maybe physical threat to the Jewish community? Where is it coming from? And also from a grassroots perspective, where is the most support in Southern African society coming from?
So I think the greatest, I don't think at this point I can say that there is an enormous physical threat to the South African Jewish community, certainly not an outside physical threat to the South African Jewish community, but because we are seeing this ratcheting up of government rhetoric against Israel, together with placing the South African Jewish community as a Zionist community at the forefront of that rhetoric, that does create a concerning environment for South African Jewry, that this kind of rhetoric will perhaps lead to a violent, some kind of violent incidents. We have had a few. We've had a rabbi who was attacked on a highway. We've had people who've been attacked on their way to shul, but they are very few and far between. And we are fortunate that we really do have strong institutions to protect us as well in that respect. So that's the first half of your question. In terms of the support for the South African Jewish community, we really are looking at not necessarily the formal churches, because unfortunately the Anglican Church was another grouping in South Africa who met with Hamas and who have a picture on the steps of the church in Cape Town, really with their arms around basically the defenders and apologetic murderers, rapists and kidnappers, and that's something that's really distressing for the South African Jewish community. Having said that, there are many churches. There's the African churches, the Shembe Church, for example. Their pastors, many churches work through pastors in South Africa, and we have a group called South African Friends of Israel, who are really providing us with enormous support on the ground, and who don't really, and I don't think that there is a deep well of anti-Semitism within the core of South African society. We are, after all, a very tolerant society. And I think that the government rhetoric, while it's intimidating and it's trying to rile up, or perhaps not trying, but its effect might be to rile up portions of the community, effectively, it's not landing on fertile ground from a violence point of view, I hope.
Good. And Karen, I guess on a final note, is there any last message or word that you would like our viewers in the United States to know about South Africa or to watch out for? Or what's your message to the American Jewish community?
You know, I think that I think the only thing that I have to say to you, and again, it might seem strange coming, or maybe not to Americans, we do feel deeply betrayed by our government as South African citizens. But it hasn't stopped us from being really proud South Africans. And I know that Americans don't necessarily know our sports, but we cheer for our rugby team, we cheer for our sports teams. We don't want to feel that the way our government has behaved in this particular instance should strip us of the pride that we feel as South Africans. And I hope that people can understand that, because as you've pointed out a number of times in this interview, we do live in quite a contradictory, paradoxical space. It's a difficult space to live in, and we are keeping an eye on all the possibilities.
Charles, I think we have time to slip in one more question before we have to wrap this up. We haven't talked yet much, Karen, about Israel. I mean, Israel has had a diplomatic presence in South Africa for many years. It's had an ambassador, it's had a whole team there. It's not been easy. but nonetheless, the relationship has continued. What's happened as a result of South Africa's behavior since October the 7th and its leadership in the ICJ on the so-called genocide case? What's left of the Israeli presence in South Africa? What's left of the trade relationship? Is there anything that's been salvaged?
So we have a fully functioning embassy, Israeli embassy in South Africa, but the Israeli ambassador has been recalled to Israel and was recalled to Israel a few weeks, maybe a few months ago. And that is also very upsetting for the community, who, as Charles has said, and you have said, is a very strongly Zionist community, and feels very strongly the connection between our country and Israel. So at the moment, the diplomatic relations are certainly frayed. There is a small amount of trade between South Africa and Israel, but it is relatively small. The ambassador is back in Israel. The Israeli ambassador is back in Israel, but the rest of the embassy is in fact still functioning. And as a South African community, obviously, we really do hope that it is a relationship that will, as tense and as difficult as it's been, will survive this very difficult time. And there will be a day after, and there will be a change. There's definitely going to be a change at some point in the South African government. And we hope that relations will improve as soon as that happens. We also really, sorry, I know you didn't ask me this, but we actually very much as a South African Jewry community take the position that the ANC government, we believe, should be taking, which is the miracle of the transition to a post-apartheid South Africa was very clearly about engagement and talking to both sides. And the one thing that perhaps we have managed to get through to the president, because he has changed his views and he has changed his statements in terms of now at least acknowledging that there are innocent civilian deaths on both sides. We really do think that the South African government could have played a meaningful role, given their relationship with Hamas, in calling effectively for the hostages to be released and in playing a role in proper peacemaking, in the really hard, difficult work in creating a sustainable peace. And it's a great pity that they have chosen not to do that.
I think in inviting Karen, Charles, you invited an extraordinary leader with a very powerful story that all of us JBS viewers around the country and around the world really need to hear and to absorb. So,
agreed.
Karen, my thanks to you, and my thanks to you, Charles, for having invited Karen.
Karen, thanks for taking the time to join us, and continued strength, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.